actively be anti-sexist, just as we have to be anti-racist today.
Here's my next question. How do we... Let me see if I can get this.
Hit it.
The argument being made is that she's supposedly thrilled with the settlement because it allows her to continue pursuing attorney's fees, not damages. So the obvious question becomes, what exactly is the goal here? What's the best case, financial outcome, and who is expected to pay it? But the response immediately tries to move away from money altogether, insisting the lawsuit was never primarily about financial compensation. According to them, it was about accountability, exposing what they describe as an underground smear campaign that allegedly retaliated against her after she raised claims of sexual harassment and retaliation. They argue the case has already had a broader impact, pointing to information now surfacing in other lawsuits, including the Nicholas case and the Amanda Ghost case. Their claim is essentially that this supposed smear machine has now been exposed, and people will start recognizing the pattern whenever another anonymous hate campaign appears online. The way it's framed almost turns Blake into some kind of crusader protecting the public from internet harassment. The suggestion is that because of her lawsuit, people will now think twice when they see anonymous attacks online and start questioning who is really behind them. But that logic feels incredibly exaggerated. Internet harassment existed long before this case, and it will continue long after it. People are still allowed to dislike public figures and express negative opinions about them. The legal line is crossed when false facts are invented, not when harsh opinions are shared. If someone thinks a celebrity comes across as rude, entitled, or mean-spirited based on public interviews and behavior, they are free to say that. That's why the old interview with the Norwegian journalist keeps resurfacing. It wasn't some elaborate smear operation. People reacted to it because Blake Lively and Parker Posey genuinely came across as dismissive and unpleasant during what should have been a routine press interview. For many viewers, it triggered memories of the kind of behavior people associate with school bullying and social exclusion. The reaction wasn't manufactured. It was organic public perception based on what viewers saw for themselves. And Parker Posey didn't escape criticism either. A lot of viewers felt she looked just as rude in that interaction. That's what makes the attempt to blame every negative reaction on some coordinated campaign feel disconnected from reality. The larger criticism here is that the lawsuit appears rooted in the belief that widespread public dislike could not possibly happen naturally. The implication seems to be that if people reacted negatively to Blake Lively, someone powerful must have orchestrated it behind the scenes. Critics argue that explanation ignores the obvious possibility that public opinion was shaped by her own public behavior and media appearances. From a legal perspective, it also creates an unusual tension because defamation law traditionally treats truth as an absolute defense. That's why some observers struggle with retaliation claims built around negative online commentary, when much of the criticism stems from publicly available interviews, clips, and interactions people can watch themselves. And honestly, for trial lawyers, a case involving an opponent perceived as this, tone deaf, would probably have been irresistible in court. Attorneys live for opportunities to cross-examine witnesses, whose public statements already create credibility problems on their own. Cases like that become especially attractive because juries tend to respond strongly when they feel someone lacks self-awareness or refuses to acknowledge obvious public perception issues. The criticism here is that certain high-powered lawyers and media figures become so disconnected from ordinary public perception that they completely misread how people actually react to situations like this. The argument is that there's a kind of insulated mindset within elite legal and media circles where they convince themselves the public relations strategy is working even while the public is reacting in the exact opposite way. That's why the interviewer's reaction to this particular appearance became such a talking point. Even articles written about the interview afterward reportedly described it as awkward and poorly received. It reinforced the old saying that clients often end up with lawyers who reflect their own worldview and decision-making. In this case, critics believe the legal strategy mirrors the same tone deafness they see in Blake Lively's public image. The discussion then shifts to a broader question. Should major celebrities even pursue these kinds of public legal battles in the first place? When someone has a massive brand, businesses, and a film career, every lawsuit risks turning their reputation into endless public drama rather than focusing attention on their actual work. But the counter-argument from Blake Lively's side is that remaining silent isn't an option if someone believes they are the target of coordinated online attacks. The claim is that digital smear campaigns can damage reputations in ways that feel impossible to fight unless exposed publicly. From that perspective, the lawsuit is framed as an attempt to shine a light on anonymous online tactics and hold people accountable. Critics, however, argue this framing misunderstands how public opinion actually forms. They point out that negative coverage and online criticism are not unique experiences for celebrities. Public figures across politics, entertainment, and media have dealt with relentless attacks for decades, without trying to turn every wave of criticism into evidence of a conspiracy. One example brought up was the speaker's own experience during political and media conflicts years earlier. They described being targeted by tabloid headlines and negative press coverage, including sensational magazine covers and personal attacks. But instead of treating every article as part of some hidden, coordinated operation, they accepted a harsher reality of public life. Some people will always believe negative narratives, while others will dismiss them no matter what. Trying to fight every attack publicly often only amplifies the story. That's why the criticism of this legal strategy becomes so severe. Opponents believe the lawsuit ultimately caused more damage to Blake Lively's image because it pushed old interviews and clips back into public circulation. Videos many people had never seen before suddenly became viral discussion points. One interview in particular, where she discussed needing creative control and authorship over projects rather than simply acting, was widely interpreted by critics as arrogant and self-important. Whether those moments are being judged fairly or unfairly, the larger point remains the same. These were public statements and behaviors that audiences evaluated on their own. Critics argue that backlash did not need to be manufactured because people were reacting directly to what they personally watched and heard. From that perspective, the lawsuit didn't improve her public standing. Instead, it intensified scrutiny, revived old controversies, and gave critics even more material to analyze. The argument being made is that once the public can directly view the interviews, clips, and statements themselves, it becomes much harder to convince people that all negative reactions stem from some invisible, coordinated smear campaign rather than ordinary public opinion. Another issue being raised here involves the way certain text messages allegedly became public. There are claims circulating that Blake Lively's team may have used a lawsuit against a publicist as a way to gain access to phones and private messages connected to Justin Baldoni and his PR team. The allegation is that the lawsuit itself may have been strategically designed to obtain those communications and eventually get them into the hands of the media, including outlets like the Los Angeles Times. The speaker makes clear they do not know whether the allegation is true, but they argue that if it were true, it would raise serious ethical concerns and could potentially warrant scrutiny from bar authorities. Their point is that it would seem hypocritical to publicly condemn manipulation and spin machines, while simultaneously engaging in aggressive legal tactics designed to shape media narratives behind the scenes. They also highlight what they see as a major weakness in Blake Lively's broader claims. According to this argument, the core allegation was never that people fabricated entirely false accusations about her. Critics point out that the complaint was not centered around invented claims like abuse, misconduct, or fictional wrongdoing. Instead, the accusation was largely that negative clips, interviews, and public moments were intentionally amplified online in a way that damaged her reputation. That distinction matters because it changes the nature of the argument completely. The criticism being discussed wasn't based on fake stories invented out of thin air. Much of it came directly from Blake Lively's own interviews, promotional appearances, and public statements. Critics argue the PR effort, if one existed, simply pushed existing material into wider circulation rather than manufacturing false evidence. That's why opponents of the lawsuit keep emphasizing that many viewers formed their opinions after watching the clips themselves. They argued that public reaction was based on authentic footage and real interviews, not fabricated lies. The discussion then shifts into speculation about the legal strategy after Judge Limon reportedly issued a damaging ruling criticizing Blake Lively's legal team. According to the speaker, the judge's language was so harsh that it potentially exposed her attorneys to legal malpractice concerns. The theory being suggested is that once the case suffered major setbacks, the lawyer suddenly had strong incentives to move the dispute into private mediation as quickly as possible. The reasoning behind that theory is straightforward. Private mediation can prevent further damaging information, embarrassing testimony, or judicial criticism from becoming public. It can also reduce the likelihood of prolonged litigation that might expose mistakes made by the legal team during the handling of the case. Of course, much of this discussion remains speculative and reflects opinions about motivations and strategy rather than proven facts. But the larger themes throughout the conversation is skepticism toward the idea that this was purely a principled accountability effort. Critics increasingly see it as a public relations and legal battle that spiraled into broader scrutiny of Blake Lively herself, her public image, and the decisions made by her legal team. The theory being discussed here is that the sudden move toward private mediation may not have been primarily about resolving the dispute peacefully, but instead about protecting Blake Lively's legal team from potential malpractice exposure after the case reportedly suffered major setbacks in court. The speaker points to a California Supreme Court ruling that allegedly limits legal malpractice claims when disputes are resolved through private mediation. Since the mediation reportedly involved a California-based mediator, the argument is that entering mediation could create an additional layer of legal protection for the attorneys involved. In this interpretation, the mediation strategy becomes less about the merits of the case itself and more about containing fallout after Judge Lemon's criticism of the legal arguments and handling of the lawsuit. The suggestion is that once the judge issued a strongly worded order criticizing parts of the case, the lawyers may have faced the possibility of accusations that the litigation had been mishandled from the beginning. According to this cynical reading of events, pushing the parties into private mediation could help limit future liability, reduce public scrutiny, and avoid prolonged litigation that might expose additional weaknesses in the legal strategy. The discussion also criticizes the public messaging that followed. After the settlement discussions, there were still attempts to frame the outcome as some kind of victory through references to attorneys' fees or remaining legal claims. Critics argued this looked more like an effort to save face publicly after the core claims had already been significantly weakened. A major focus of the criticism centers on the contractual foundation of the lawsuit itself. According to the argument presented, one of the central claims depended on an agreement between the parties that may never have actually been finalized or fully executed. During discovery, multiple versions of the contract reportedly surfaced, but there allegedly was no clear final agreement signed by all relevant parties. That became a serious issue because courts generally require a clear meeting of the minds before enforcing contractual obligations. If several draft versions exist and no final, fully signed agreement can be identified, judges are often reluctant to simply choose which draft should govern the dispute. The speaker emphasizes that this is basic contract law, something even first-year law students are taught. Their criticism is essentially that experienced, high-profile attorneys should never have built major legal claims on such uncertain contractual footing. If the underlying agreement could not be clearly established, then the entire legal strategy becomes vulnerable from the start. That's why the conversation frames the situation as an example of what can happen when wealthy clients rely on massive law firms that may overcomplicate cases or aggressively pursue litigation despite obvious weaknesses. The old joke being referenced is that hiring giant firms sometimes creates an environment where too many resources, too much ego, and too much momentum push cases further than they realistically should go. By the end, the broader argument is that the lawsuit may have evolved into a combination of legal overreach, public relations damage, and strategic maneuvering designed more to contain consequences than to achieve the original goals publicly presented at the beginning.